Oh, Katrina, I was letting it know. We are expecting a storm with some good sized hail.
Oh
which,
no.
My Wi-Fi working is a lucky thing on a good day. So if you
Okay.
lose me, I'll try to come back. And
Okay.
if you lose me and I can't come back, then figure it out, I guess.
Yeah, no, we will carry on.
I will see you when the recording is done.
Okay. Should we start, or are we waiting for more people?
Megan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you can start now. People will probably still trickle in, but I think it's okay.
People can join us as they join us.
Yeah.
I'm Katrina Hawking. I'm married to Robert Hawking, who is Stephen Hawking's eldest son. And we are just, I watched The Theory of Everything again for the second time in my life. The first time a producer came up from California to show it to us when it was in pre-release. So that was a very interesting experience of watching A Theory of Everything in a completely empty theater with just my husband and myself sitting in the middle of a completely empty theater, and with the two producers sitting in the back. So I watched it again over the weekend on my phone, which was a more normal movie experience for me. Eddie Redmayne is just so good in that film, and he is such a nice person as well. But that's my favorite thing about that film, is just what an amazing performance Eddie turns in as Stephen. That was when Stephen saw it himself, he was really moved, and he had a similar experience of just being himself and his care team in a theater watching it for the first time. And he said he felt like he was watching himself as at that performance, and was so incredibly moved by it that he volunteered his own voice. They had another computerized voice that they had recorded for the ending scenes. But Stephen was so incredibly moved by it that he went into a recording studio and redid the sound for that in the final scenes after he receives his computerized voice. And Eddie was very funny when he was sort of talking about the film, because of course he was moderately well-known actor at that time. And when Stephen came on set, people mobbed around Stephen, and Eddie was literally pushed like out of the inner circle and into kind of the corner of the room. As people kind of use, they were like television reporters or fans. I'm not 100% clear on the details of the story, were, kind of flocking around Eddie, and then Stephen kind of rolled in, and suddenly Eddie found himself completely like to the side so that people could get near Steve. That was just what being with him was like. You would go into a perfectly ordinary situation where one thing would be happening. One time I took him to the circus, and after the circus, we went to Teatro Zinzani, and afterwards the circus performers were lined up to get their picture taken with Stephen. So everything was usually turned on its head in a situation where you were with him, that you would be, if other people were lining up to get autographs, the people who were lining up to get autographs would get in line to get their picture taken with Stephen. The film was very strange from a timeline standpoint. When we went in to see it, when we went in to see this film in the theater, the producer who'd come up told my husband, now remember, this is like someone had written a poem about your life. It's not a novelization or a history. It's like as if somebody had written a poem about your life. So, an entire life, years and years, 20, 30 years condensed into a 1.5 hour film meant that time ran very strangely from our perspective, and event several people were conflated into a single person. Events happened in a different order than they did. The children are very young, and some of the things that happened to Robert and Lucy in the film actually happened to Lucy and Robert's much younger brother, Tim, because the children remain kind of 7 or 8 years old for a period of 15 or 16 years of real life. And the children, the second time I watched it, the first time, there really was a good deal I felt a good sense of the family the first time I watched it. The second time I realized how it really is a story about Stephen, and to some extent Jane, and the family are really, the children are really there in the film as in a very, very small capacity, when really a lot of Stephen's life was about his family. So, yeah, I don't know really what questions you might have or what you would like me to talk about, Sunny.
As questions come up, guys, drop them in the chat box and we'll get to them. I have one on my email that I'm going to read to you in a second.
Sure.
I think one of my, we were kind of chatting we invited everybody in, and was like, I have never known someone to have a movie made about their life. Like, no, so to take someone and then that I know well, and then to see their life portrayed through a third party with actors and others, it just, to me, seems like chaos. And so, and I guess especially, or seeing how well the main actor did with the portrayal of symptoms, not knowing Stephen during that time.
Well, and of course, I didn't know him through that time either. The film ends in approximately 1988 or 1989 at a lecture that he's giving following the publication of A Brief History of Time. I met Stephen probably 6 or 8 years after that. So, but I have seen, and Eddie saw it too, a lot of home movie, a lot of recorded, because of course Stephen gave recorded lectures before that, and family photos, and it is really a splendid portrayal of Stephen. And Stephen acknowledged it, people close to him acknowledged it. Stephen's joke was that, sometimes he would joke that Eddie was a much better looking version of himself, and then other times he would stand it on its ear and say actually he was the better looking Stephen Hawking. I think both were true in their own way, but really captured that role and what he was like as a person. I can't say enough nice things about Eddie's performance in that film. It's one of my all-time favorite performances of any actor in any role. That being said, it really is very, very strange to see people you know well have their lives turned into a film. And other people in the film are less recognizable. I laughed and cried in all the wrong spots in the film because they are, they're my family, people I'm close to. And, some of the things that they do are just so like them. So like one of the scenes is the croquet scene. And in the croquet scene, this was important to Jane, that she and Stephen fairly early on in their relationship had a date where he played an extremely aggressive game of croquet. And in the film, it's sort of meant to be him pushing her away and her insisting that she wants to be in a relationship with him in spite of the ALS and him sort of, but really from my experience of Stephen playing croquet, he was just an extremely aggressive croquet player in and of itself. And, fairly, it wasn't that far out when I saw this film that he had been playing croquet at the night before my wedding. And he was like charging around we were trying to play a civilized game of croquet, and Stephen was charging around the croquet pitch, running over other people's balls and honking his horn and knocking down the wickets, and just, we were all having a really good time. And so I was just like, that's just how he played croquet. But so I laughed because, of course, for me, knowing where the story would go, that, from that point, that wasn't his last game of croquet. Years later, 35 years later, he would be at my wedding playing croquet the night before, and, later playing croquet in like the fellows garden in the college gardens with my kids, stealing the balls, or them cheating cheating at croquet. So yes, my experience with the film was probably different than most people's experience with the film.
I think most people on this call would agree that, especially through this movie club, the times in a movie where you're supposed to feel this immense emotion or sadness, some of us are laughing because it's like, oh yeah, I did that, or I
Sure. Yeah.
Get you to call me out on it, or we can empathize with the character in a way that nobody else can.
Right. Yeah, to just know how difficult some of these things were, and they don't really show it in this film, just how difficult Stephen and Jane and the family's life was. There in the film, because of course, films are expensive to make. And also they're trying to tell a particular version of the story, a Hollywood version of the story. They keep the cast simple and the storyline simple, but there were a lot of people around Stephen throughout this entire period of time that you don't see. The first caretaker that comes into the story is quite late, and there's just one. But really, starting when Jane took care of Stephen on her own, and two small children, I have no idea how, but Stephen was progressing pretty slowly at that point. So when Lucy was born, Stephen was still partially mobile. He had a scooter, fairly independent. And then when my sister-in-law, when my husband's sister was 3 or 4 years old, they went to California for a year. And when they came back from California, they moved into a different, when they went to California, at Jane's suggestion, she said, let's take some of the students with us and they can help you. And that worked out so well that when they came back, they moved out of the tiny little house. You see this tiny little house in the film that they're living in. And that's actually, Jane still has the house. The house in the film is much larger than the real house, which is really the most adorable little doll's house you can ever imagine. It's absolutely charming. Right in the center of town. You could literally toss you could toss a ball into Stephen's office almost from the window. So they were that close to where he worked, but it was all stairs. It was completely unsuited. And when he couldn't get up the stairs, there was no room downstairs for them to put a bed. They show her in the film putting a bed in the kitchen or the living room. There's no room in the real house for that to have happened. So when they came back, that house was really not suited for Stephen's life anymore. So they swapped houses with the college. The college took over their house and let it out to, rented it out, and Stephen and the family moved into a much, much larger house. And above this house, there were rooms, and Stephen's students lived in the rooms and helped him in exchange for their rooms with his everyday needs. And these people are all, people who are still in our lives, who well-known physicists, cosmologists, and talking about that sort of situation was unusual at the time, but now would absolutely unheard of, that a professor would be living in a house with his PhD students who would be helping him, get dressed in the morning and, eat, and taking him to work and bringing him home, and, helping him get ready for bed in the evening. I don't know, maybe perhaps under similar circumstances, similar things are still happening. But from that point on, from the time that the family moved back from California, my husband was about 8 years old. There were a lot of people in their lives all the time. At first, unpaid caregivers, the students, and then paid caregivers. And, that's another thing. I work now for the ALS Association, just my local chapter, and I do development for them, fundraising. And so I meet people and see how hard their lives are, really hard for families, for family caregivers. Some people have access to more paid caregivers than others, but even people say who, like veterans who have, 40, 50, 60, sometimes hours a week paid for by the Veterans Association, have a hard time finding the caregivers. Depending on where they live, those people may or may not be available to them. Other people don't have those benefits and have to pay. Like one of the people in our group got a small grant so that she could take a vacation, which was the only one that she'd had in many years since her family member needed round the clock care. It's really very sad. But Stephen had a lot of people, and I tell that to people that there were a lot of people. When he was living on his own, in his late 60s, 70s, there was a team of 12 or 14 people who managed his health care, which is really not it, that's really how much care it takes. And that's not what people are able to access, but there was a team of 2 caregivers on at all times in 3 shifts during the day that took care of him and, allowed him to do all of the things that he wanted to do to continue to work. And, he continued to go into the office and work for his entire life up until a month and a half before he passed at the age of 76. Even once he was at home in his room, there was a whiteboard in his room, and when we came for the funeral, there were brand new equations on the board. He had been working with colleagues right up until just a few weeks before he passed. So, but the point I was making is that there were a lot of people in his life, and the film really does not show the hardship, the amount of work that it took from friends, family members, caregivers to care for Stephen, and it doesn't really show just how hard all of those people were working. But as people with ALS, people in the ALS community, you all know.
One of the questions from the chat is from Desi that says, how did the children feel about Jonathan when they were little?
Well, I mean, the film is very confusing because the children were not that little when Stephen and when Jonathan enters their life. My husband was 10, Lucy was 6. Tim, of course, had not yet been born, but they weren't as young as they're shown to be in the film. And for a long period of time, Jonathan was one of the many caregivers who was helping the family. So he's kind of shown in the film to be like the only one kind of helping Jane out in an unpaid capacity. I think that for us, that was kind of representative of what was actually going on. That at that point, Stephen's care was being managed by friends of the family, and Jonathan was one of many friends of the family. It wasn't until later that he and Jane became close. And at that point, Stephen was also becoming close to one of his caregivers. And of course, they separated fairly amicably and, each formed a different relationship. Their lives at that point were kind of headed in different directions. Stephen was very interested in, being well known. He loved popularizing science. He wanted to travel a lot. He, wanted to be on stage, and, really that was what gave him a lot of energy, a lot of life. Jane was more private, didn't like to travel, didn't like that feeling of being, nobody likes that feeling that Eddie Redmayne experienced of being pushed to one side as Stephen entered the room.
That would be a big sin for me if I did not remove it. Look at that.
And so they went in fairly different directions.
That you have right now.
But remained close friends throughout the rest of their lives.
Sure. What was it like meeting Stephen for the first time?
Oh gosh, this is a really funny story. So At that point, I was quite young. I was in my 20s, but I'd been working since I was a teenager, doing summer camps for kids with high needs. So, kids that had medical needs, used wheelchairs. So I was kind of used to that sort of thing. And Robert was fairly private about his family life. So when we started seeing each other one day, he was just asked me if I wanted to flip through a family photo album. So I said, okay. So we sat down and he was, showing me pictures from college, and he was a hiker and a climber. So he was showing me pictures of climbing, his friends in England. And then he sort of flipped to this picture where he's like standing in this picture with Stephen Hawking. And I pointed to the picture and I said, who's that? And he just said, oh, that's my dad. And then he turned the page. And then it was back to he was climbing and walking. And I was like, did I just see what I think I saw? That, it seems strange. And of course, this is before the internet in its current form existed. It was in 95, 96. I was at university. I was an art student. So the next day I did the equivalent of Googling someone. I went to the physics and engineering building and went into the library. And I pulled down all the Stephen Hawking books, every single one. I put them on a table in front of me. And I flipped through the indexes of these books until I found Robert's name. And then I confirmed that, yes, that what I'd seen was likely true. And we didn't really have much of a conversation about it. But I did read this section of the book where I had found my husband's name. It was in the notes at the back of Black Holes and Baby Universes. And the back of this were the notes from a radio interview that Stephen had given just fairly shortly after publication of A Brief History of Time. And Desert Island Discs, they ask you to kind of pick your top 10 favorite musical pieces that you would take with you if you were stranded on a desert island and only had like 10 things to listen to for the rest of your existence. And in between the music tracks, the interviewer asks questions. And one of the answers that Stephen gave in this really stuck with me as I was kind of considering this for the first time, which is that he wouldn't wish for anyone to have ALS, that it was a terrible, terrible diagnosis, but for him, it had really galvanized his purpose in life, realizing that he only had a short time, he thought, to live, had really focused his energy in a way that he hadn't been before. And so for him, it had been a very important thing that he didn't think that he would have been as successful if that hadn't happened to him. It was, that and getting a really interesting question to work on in the early part of his career. Black holes, the Big Bang, and the beginning of our universe. So, really having a sense of time is short and I'm going to make the most of it. And also having a really interesting question and being in a really interesting period of time, he felt had been important to him. And I thought, gosh, that's really interesting. I kind of filed that away as, and that was really on my mind when I first met him. And actually the first meeting him was a complete shambles because I was an art student and I worked in a foundry. So a lot of times I was just like really filthy, but I knew that I was going to be meeting Robert's dad for the first time. Robert said, come, my dad's giving a lecture. This is the very second time we talked about his father. He said, my dad is going to be giving a lecture and I'd like you to come. And I said, okay, well, I guess your dad is Stephen Hawking. He said, yes. And I said, okay, let's do this. So he came into town. He was working in California. He worked at Caltech for part of the winter every year and had since the most of his life. So he'd been in California. He was coming up with his care team, and they were arriving, and then he was giving this lecture 2 days later. So we were supposed to go out to dinner, and I turned up in my foundry clothes, and I had a dress to wear. And Robert said, "You're going to be overdressed." So I said, "Well, the only other thing I have is my foundry clothes." He said, "Well, wear that." And I was like, looking back on it, I would have put my foot down and gone in the dress, because the foundry clothes were really very, very, very dirty. And so I was shy and like trying to keep away from Robert's dad at this dinner, because I was feeling quite awkward on a number of levels, including what I was wearing. But then 2 days later, I sort of managed to, make sure that I was dressed appropriately. And we went to this lecture and sat through the lecture, and I tried to understand the lecture. And then afterwards, Robert took me backstage, and we went around to from the backstage area with his dad into a reception area where people who had paid extra for their tickets were having a reception, and Robert and the nurses kind of got us settled at a table. And then suddenly, poof, everybody disappeared. And I was sitting alone in this VIP area, not alone because there were lots of other people there, but Stephen and I together at a table for the first time, when Stephen suddenly decided to engage me in conversation for the first time. I was completely alone. And he was sort of quizzing me on everything, like who was I and what did I do? And when had we met? When this PhD student appeared from out of nowhere. It was like a scene from the Big Bang Theory. This PhD student with a paper approached our table and said that he wanted to share his paper with Professor Hawking. And I was like, yep, go ahead. But Stephen was very interested in talking to me and finding out what my story it was. And so he really wasn't. So eventually the PhD student convinced me that because Stephen was talking to me and not to him, that I should read this PhD paper. So I took it and I was kind of stumbling through it when Robert came back and said, "What in the world is going on?" I don't really know. And the PhD student took his paper back and just kind of disappeared. I hope that he went on to do amazing things because he was a very bright person. And that is more or less how we met. And then after that, I think we all went out to dinner and then dancing, which is how Stephen ended pretty much every event that he did. One time he came here, on another occasion, because we almost always saw him. If he was traveling, it was for work because he couldn't afford to travel otherwise. To move that number of people around unless it was a work event was just too expensive and too difficult. So he would do a lecture whenever they asked for one in Seattle because he wanted to come up here and see us. So he was doing the World Science Festival. And I had 2 kids at that point, and he'd come into town to do this keynote, the keynote for this science festival and to see us. And the organizer of the event was meeting Stephen for the first time and kind of cautiously asking me, like, how do I know if this is going to be too much for him? I'm concerned about the number of engagements on the schedule and whether that's okay. And I was like, sir, you need to worry more about yourself. Because Stephen is going to drive you into the ground this week. I said, "But you need to be far more concerned about keeping up your own stamina and pacing yourself than you do about Stephen getting worn out, because we will all wear out long before he does." And sure enough, we would end many a lecture series by needing to get on the phone and call the local salsa clubs to see who had a wheelchair accessible dance floor. And long after other people thought it was time to call things an evening, Stephen would be wanting to close down the dance floor.
I love that.
That's amazing. Well, it's funny. I actually have a couple different things that kind of all revolve around Professor Hawking, and they always kind of make me just giggle inside, I guess. And so the first one being, one time my mom said, I think one of the best days of my life was when I had lunch sitting next to Stephen Hawking at the Stanford University, commissary type of thing. And I was like, I'm sorry, you did what? And she would go on and on about it. And, he was very friendly to people, and she was too shy to say anything to him directly. But it is one of her highlights in her life, which just makes me kind of laugh like, wow, it's amazing how a person that you've never known can affect you so much. The second that I found really funny is my husband, Vince, was diagnosed with ALS. And long before he was diagnosed with ALS, he was a huge Big Bang Theory television show fan. And the first time that Stephen was on the show, and it might have just been his voice, I can't remember. And it might have been him also I can't remember what it was, but somehow, God love my husband, he comes yelling out to me. He says, Glynis, come here. And I said, what? Yeah, I'm freaking out. What's wrong? He goes, I just found out Stephen Hawking is British. What do you mean you just found out? He goes, listen to his voice. It's like American. I'm all, you mean a robot? He said, yeah, but I would have thought that it would have been a British robot. And I think I laughed so hard. That was one of the funniest things that my husband had ever said to me. And again, it's about a man that I've never met, but we all seem to have embraced in one way, shape, or form, whether it's within the scientific community, whether it's within the ALS community, whether it's the Big Bang Theory fan club, whatever it happens to be. I find it amazing. But one of my fondest memories, and I'm going to call someone out on this Zoom call, is at the ALS TDI Gala one year. Someone on this call was a speaker, and she had this most amazing speech. And it was one of those types that you cried, you laughed, you did everything. But the tagline and the very last sentence was where we all just went, yep, that's it. Good night, mic drop. And Miss Kate, would you like to say what you said?
Buckle up, ladies and gents. I'm about to Stephen Hawking this shit. I'm prepared to fight for the next 50 years. So
Love it.
thanks, Linus.
You're welcome, Miss Kate.
I'll throw in my 2 cents after that tagline. When I was going through my diagnosis journey, I saw an orthopedic hoping it was carpal tunnel, and he very abruptly said it's not mechanical, it's neurological. Got up, walked out of the room. I was left there alone. I got in my car, opened my phone, and the news notification was Stephen Hawking passed away that day.
Oh.
So I feel very connected to, like Linda said, a man I never knew, unfortunately, through a disease none of us ever wanted, but truly a magical journey for him, and the fight to keep living, and the passion to find answers. I just admire his spirit. So thank you for joining us tonight.
I mean, that's really why I wanted to, do this work, and reached out to my local ALS association. It was not work that I did before Stephen passed. Man was a host unto himself, and you did not step into what he was doing. He was a patron for the Motor Neuron Disease Association, but it didn't occur to any of us to, do this while he was doing it. The man could literally speak for himself. But afterwards, so many people talked to me about, how meaningful he was to them. And I thought at that point, I would like to, be a part of this. This is something I want to do. And a lot of people have said, like, it was a part of their experience. I also, shortly after Stephen passed, we went to an award ceremony that he was an honoree. This is the Breakthrough Prize. There are large awards given in fundamental physics, mathematics, medical science. And there was a team there, two men who had recently, and a family. And the family had a very little girl with them. And she was a breakthrough patient in the treatment for spinal muscular atrophy. And this disease, they'd told her parents when she was an infant that she would not meet any of her developmental milestones and passed when she was very young, probably before she was 2. And she said to me, she said, "I've just been to Disneyland." And I said, "Oh," and she said, "I was in the parade." And I said, "That's fantastic." And she said, "You want to take a picture of me because I'm a very important person." I said, "Okay." I believe you, but it turned out she was. I mean, obviously she is as a breakthrough patient for the treatment of a disease. And there are, kids are now getting this treatment. And I follow her on Facebook. She plays hockey in a special sled, and she learns to swim and is learning to walk without her walker. In really incredible story. And she was also a very important person to me. I talked to her doctors afterwards, and they said, yes, they were working on spinal muscular atrophy, but also, new trial drugs in ALS. And I said, I want to be there when they solve this. And I don't think it seems impossible now, but I do not think that it is in the very distant future. And I don't want to be standing on the sideline when it happens.
I think that more than words can convey. That was a conversation we had last week about people that stay in the fight after their own fight is done. And I feel like as these patients, we can push the needle so far, but it's you guys that are champions that can really, really get stuff done. And it's just an amazing collaboration that I don't think happens across other disease communities. And one that I don't know that I could stay in the fight after watching someone I love go through this. So such an admiration for those of you that stay in after you're given granted opportunities to leave.
And I see it happen now a lot. I've been working for my local chapter for 2 years, and this disease, it's ruthless. It really is. And it takes everything that a family has. And I don't know, I was not in the thick of it. My family was. So it's easier for me because it hasn't taken everything I have. There were hard parts. There are hard parts so many times when, we were really scared, and Stephen would pull through again and again. Difficult, but nothing like the difficulty that most families face on a day-to-day basis. Because I was living in this country, Stephen was living there. He was fairly independent, had an amazing care team. But, I have the capacity for now to do this. And I completely understand how other people who have been through it need time to recover, because it literally takes everything and more that a person has to give.
Desi in the chat, sounds like a rougher name. Desi in the chat asked how Stephen was with his grandkids.
He was an incredible grandfather. He really was. So on the same time he came out to Seattle, he had a certain number of set questions, and that he would answer, because it took him a long time. That's another thing that people don't realize. And sometimes people ask me, like, my family member is having really slow communication, how can I help? Stephen, was able to accomplish so much, but his lectures, some of those lectures took a year to write. An hour-long lecture might have taken a year to prepare. And, sometimes we would see him for a week or 10 days and get a few short sentences from him. It didn't mean that he was any less fun to be around. Communication was an incredible struggle. And you don't see that because you come to the lecture or see some, a commercial or a television show, and think he was, communicating at a similar rate to, how I'm communicating. But on a day-to-day basis, it was not true. And there was a lot of communication that was going on separate from the computer system. People who knew him well were able to communicate pretty well with him while bypassing that system. My husband was one of the very best, able to, talk to his dad and understand facial movements after the speech was no longer available, and communicate in a much faster way than the computer equipment would allow. But one of the questions was, what did Stephen, what did he regret? And it was very sad, the answer to me, because he said he regretted not being able to be a more active parent and grandparent. But at the same time, as poignant as that was, we were having an incredible experience that day. We were backstage at the Paramount Theater in Seattle while this science festival was going on. And my kids were running around backstage during this. We were under the stage while an interpretive mathematical dance was going on over our heads. And then we were taken out into like the center stage where Stephen rolled out and called out to us, and my kids who were little stood up on their chairs, and the entire audience turned around to wave to them. And I was like, I wouldn't regret a single thing. On the one hand, one hand, there was something that he felt was worth regretting. On the other hand, being with him was, just an incredible experience. And other times very frustrating. Sometimes the kids would be wanting to go out and go to the park, and it was time to eat, it was time for care. And it was other times we would go out. There were times that we couldn't go and do things that we wanted to do because he would get mobbed by tourists. In tourist season, we spent a lot of time at home, and the kids are like, why can't we go into town? And I was like, what that experience is like. And we,
What
we
did they
can't.
call him?
They called him Granddad. Yeah, Granddad. And that's what his father had been called as well, Granddad.
I told you I have a question in the email. It's from my friend Courtney. This is kind of open-ended to the entire discussion. So if you feel comfortable answering, answer. If you don't, and want to share that with me afterwards, I would love to hear your response. And your question is, those dealing with ALS directly, I would love to hear if your faith has changed or evolved. One of the defining characteristics of Dr. Hawking was the militant atheism, one that differed from Jane's beliefs. Anyone willing to answer, do you believe in God? Was that something that changed towards the end, or was he faithless through the entire journey?
I'm not sure is this a question for me? I'm not really sure I understand the question.
It's emphasizing on the conversations they had in the movie about him being an atheist and Jane having religion.
Oh, okay. Yes. No, I didn't think that was particularly well portrayed, because I don't think that Stephen really considered himself to be an atheist, in that he didn't believe in God. I think he considered himself to be an agnostic, in that he didn't know, he didn't have the answer one way or another. And to me, and I'm a person of faith, I met my husband at church, and my husband is a person of faith. They, Jane and her children are Church of England. And we always went to church when we were there. We go to church here. But to me, my perspective, and this is 100% just me, is that Stephen was one of the most legitimate seekers after truth that I ever met. It's just he was seeking it through the scientific world. He was not arrogant. He never pretended that he had an answer to something. He was just legitimately looking along with everybody else. And there was some conflict because, around faith with Jane, but it was not what was portrayed in the film. I don't think so. But, I think that his, legitimate search for answers was one of the things that was, very important to his life.
I think one of the most endearing relationships in the movie itself might not be one that, was meant to be, in my opinion. But I think the relationship in the movie again of Jonathan and Stephen together seemed just like a lovely relationship. And I'm not taking into the Jane effect. I'm just those two men that just seem to be able to have this great relationship and bond and laugh and watch these children, your husband grow up. And it really, for some reason, that was the one relationship I took away from the movie that I just thought, wow, that was really, really inspiring to see. And I don't know, I mean, again, it might be a difficult subject, but I'm just curious if, how that relationship is with, your husband and his siblings with Jonathan, if it was anything that was relatively true, that feeling.
I think that there was a bit more distance between Stephen and Jonathan than what was actually portrayed, at least during my relationship. I think that they were closer at one point, and then when they sort of split into two families, they were more distant. But certainly, we would get together for holidays, family meals, and the family is all obviously very close to Jonathan now.
That's great.
Did Stephen have a favorite sports team? No, he was into rowing. I tell this to people too, and my husband is not really into sports, but they do watch the rowing. So there was always a tremendous amount of interest in the Cambridge versus Oxford race on the Thames. And of course, Stephen had been to both Cambridge and Oxford, so it didn't really matter. The competition was largely symbolic, but they enjoyed watching the boat racing. And one of the things that I regret is that I was not able to go to the Olympics, because of course he opened the opening ceremony for the Paralympics in London, and my family members just say that was one of the most incredible experiences, being there for that. So not a big sports fan, not an indifferent sports fan. I think he followed sports. He watched the news for a couple of hours every evening. So he could have told you what was happening in the world of sports, because he watched that along with everything else.
Well, we're coming up on an hour. Does anybody have any questions they want to wrap with, or if you email them to me, I can get them to Katrina. I want to say thank you very much for coming tonight.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
I remember meeting you in virtual formats as a symposium, just being like, holy crap, I just met Katrina Hawking. And that relationship, I still have that feeling. So I'm thankful that you are so committed.
Well, hopefully as the world gets back to normal, we'll have an opportunity to actually get together, because I was just out in New Orleans 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, for the Answer ALS gala, and there's nothing really like it. My work is in fundraising for care services, but my true passion is what's going on in the research community. So I look forward to meeting you all in person, and hopefully that day will not be too distant.
Thank you so much. It was really informative.
Thank you.
And we'll see everyone next week, next Tuesday, for our finale. I can't believe we're to the end for film 5 of Trans Fatty Lives. And Patrick O'Brien is on the call tonight, so him and Michelle will be moderating the conversation next week, and I can't wait to hear y'all's takeaways from the movie. And I hope y'all have a good week.
Yay. Thanks, Katrina. Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Well,